Welcome to MidPoint. I'm Seán Kinane. I'm the host of MidPoint Monday. There are two annual events coming up this Saturday that we've covered in years past. Our guests today will talk about Hands Across the Sand, supporting clean energy, opposing dirty fuels, and saying no to offshore drilling. But first we'll hear about March Against Monsanto. Groups are uniting to demand labeling of genetically engineered food. We'd like your input, so here's how you can join the conversation. The number is 813-239-9663. If you call in now, you can be first on the air. You can also email your question or comment to dj@wmnf.org. You can text us at 813-433-0885. If you call now, we'll put you on as soon as we get your call. Before we begin, we have a listener comment. Here's someone commenting about previous shows.
I don't know if it's important, but executive order was passed this month, May 6th, for a kind of transition team for the next presidential elect, starting 6 months before the presidential election. I don't know, it just caught me by surprise. I didn't hear nothing on the news about it, and I'm not sure why you would need the same employees of the current administration to usher in an entirely different administration. Does that seem like it's got an agenda?
That was a listener commenting about a previous show. Later on in the broadcast, they'll give out the number for you to leave a voicemail. You can always comment on our stories on our website. That's wmnf.org/news. You can join the conversation on Twitter or Facebook at WMNF News. My first guest today is Christine Wall. She's helping to organize this Saturday's March Against Monsanto Tampa. It's from 10 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon at Gaslight Square Park in downtown Tampa. Welcome to WMNF's MidPoint, Christine.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. Tell us, what is March Against Monsanto and what's been the history of this march?
March Against Monsanto is a rally and march that wants to raise public awareness about the basically evils of Monsanto, specifically working on getting genetically modified foods labeled so consumers know what they're feeding themselves and feeding their children. The march has been going on for several years now. We used to do it 2 times a year. This year we're doing it in May, and we're also going to have a rally in October, on October 16th, in coordination with the World Food Day. And there's going to be an international tribunal in The Hague against Monsanto the weekend of October 14th through 16th.
What is it about genetically modified foods that you oppose?
Well, there's a number of reasons. There hasn't been long-term clinical trials that prove that they're safe for human consumption. A lot of research has been done that's been suppressed by Monsanto. Scientists that have done long-term studies on lab animals have been discredited. Monsanto has been allowed to do its own studies, which are skewed in their favor. So we don't know that genetically modified foods are safe. There's no long-term studies on humans. As well as a lot of genetically modified foods are engineered to produce their own toxin or be resistant to the herbicide Roundup, which Monsanto produces. So these are organisms, corn for example, that produces its own toxin inside the cell. So every part of the cell of the corn has this Bt toxin. That hasn't been proven for human consumption to be safe. With the Roundup Ready soybeans, they are genetically engineered to resist the herbicide Roundup. So millions and millions of gallons of herbicide Roundup are sprayed on soybean crops every year. So not only are the soybean crops genetically modified, which we don't know is safe, but they're also liberally sprayed with this Roundup. And Roundup, glyphosate, has just recently been designated a possible carcinogen by the World Health Organization.
Is there a role in glyphosate or in other pesticides that are used on genetically modified organisms with the declining bee population?
I don't know if the studies have been proven it, but of course lots of insects are being affected by the insecticides and herbicides and pesticides that are sprayed on crops.
So you are asking for labeling of genetically modified foods, so that will give consumers, if they do become if they do become labeled, then that gives consumers the choice to be able to say, it's okay, I'll buy this, I don't have a problem with genetically modified organisms, or I can say, I choose not to. But there's still been resistance, even just against labeling. What's been the history of people's initiatives to try to get food labeled, and how have they turned out?
Well, I believe Vermont and Connecticut passed laws for labeling so that their foods could be labeled. Monsanto, of course, has tried to lobby against that and thrown millions and millions of dollars into these campaigns to get these bills not passed. There's a federal act called, what we call it is the Deny the Americans the Right to Know Act that just did not pass the Senate, but it was only by one vote that it did not pass. And that particular legislation would make it against the law for states to have labeling of GMOs on products.
The number to call is 813-239-9663. If you'd like to join this conversation, we're talking with Christine Wall. She's helping to organize this Saturday's March Against Monsanto in Tampa. There are also marches in Sarasota, Spring Hill, and Orlando. And I'll mention some more about those in a minute, but give us a call now if you'd like, dj@wmnf.org if you'd like to email us, and 813-433-0885 is how you can text us. Our guest is Christine Wall. And Christine, so what is the DARK Act? And I think this still has to do with labeling of genetically modified foods?
Correct. It's a federal act, a federal bill. It passed the House, and recently it just did not pass the Senate by one vote. It was like 48 to 49. Rubio did not vote because he was campaigning at the time, but Nelson did vote against the DARK Act, and that's what we want. We want our legislators to vote against the DARK Act because it denies the Americans the right to know what's in their food. So what companies are doing, like Monsanto, for example, is they're trying to influence politicians, of course, with lobbying funds, and get them to say that states can't put GMO, this product contains GMOs on labels.
Is that what you mean by dark? I'm trying to get the name.
Yes,
of it.
deny Americans the right to know what's in their food. So what people want is to have a label on their food. What the companies want that produce this is not to have a label. So that's what the deny the Americans right to know comes in.
I think we're getting some phone calls, so why don't we go to Nick in St. Pete. Hi, Nick. Do you have a question or a comment?
Hey, Sean. Yes, I'd like to ask your guest, what can she tell us about these agricultural gag laws that makes it a crime just to take a picture of these corporate farms? I'll take my answer off there. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Nick.
Well, I don't have a lot of details about that, but I certainly think that these laws are a violation of our constitutional rights. They're a violation of animal rights because some of the things that go on in these agricultural farms are horrendous. And if people knew what was going on, there'd probably be a lot more vegetarians walking around. But I definitely think that's a great question, and thank you for bringing it up.
And these are laws that make it specifically if you take photos or videos at an agricultural...
Like a factory farm, for example, where there's a lot of bad stuff that happens to the animals, a lot of torture, a lot of suffering, a lot of disgusting practices, unclean practices, even on a health basis. And if people knew what was going on, they would be outraged.
They're also called ag-gag bills for short, and so it's just a way for the industry maybe to kind of keep a little bit more secrecy.
Hide what they're doing.
813-239-9663 if you'd like to ask a question about March Against Monsanto. We have another person on the line. It's Mike calling from the Gulf of Mexico. What's that all about?
Well, I'm on Honeymoon Island.
I'm jealous.
Sitting here looking at the Gulf of Mexico. I was calling because we not only need labeling, we need information disseminated with why they are doing the GMO. They are doing the GMO to make the plant tolerant to a poison. I mean, the whole concept is wrong. And they shouldn't even be doing it. If they're going to GMO, they should make a better tasting tomato or whatever. But we should know, not just only what they're doing it, but why. I'll take it as that.
Okay, well, Mike, thanks so much. And so what about that point that, making these plants, genetically modifying these plants in order to be able to put more poisons on them? We talked a little bit about it earlier, but it seems that it's kind of like a roundabout way, no pun intended, to go about putting more poisons into the crops.
Well, here it's all about the money. Follow the money. Monsanto produces the genetically modified crops, and then it sells the Roundup to spray upon them. So it's all about money making. Monsanto has a history of ecocide and violations of human rights with their poisons. They have over 50 Superfund sites in the United States. I could go on and on about the evils of Monsanto, but basically, Mike, what they're doing is trying to make more money. They're selling the genetically modified seed, and then they're selling the herbicide that goes on top of it.
Well, Monsanto would say, in fairness, is that what they're doing is they're being able to allow farmers, allow agricultural businesses to create more food, to help the world food shortage by doing this. So that's what.
Well, that's a great branding statement, but the history of Monsanto shows that they are not trying to feed the world, that they're trying to make a profit. You have to remember that Monsanto, the producers of Agent Orange, DDT, PCPs. Also, they were involved in the Manhattan Project with the nuclear department. So they've always been involved with poison and war and destruction. They're not about feeding the world. They're about making money. They're buying more seed companies up now, and they're trying to get a larger market share of the agribusiness, and they want control over the food supply, because that way they'll make more profits for their shareholders.
Our guest is Christine Wall. She's helping to organize this Saturday's March Against Monsanto in Tampa. We'll talk more about when and where that is at the end of the segment. You mentioned seeds, and so when you have a plant, it produces seeds, and if you've genetically modified that plant, the seeds will often also have the genetic modification. What happens when the genetically modified seeds get spread in the wind or by birds or whatever, and then they go somewhere that they weren't originally planted?
Exactly, Sean. This is the major problem. You can't stop the wind and you can't control the wind. So there's transgenic mutation between species. And this is not a contained experiment. This is an open air experiment where everybody and all the plants are being exposed to it. Monsanto can't control their genetically engineered technology. In Oaxaca, Mexico, where there's indigenous corn that's been there for over 10,000 years, that corn has been contaminated by the pollen blowing on the wind from Monsanto's genetically modified corn. There's a great documentary called The World According to Monsanto that you can find online, and I highly recommend people take a look at that documentary to know more about the subject.
A conscientious way to go about genetically modifying organisms is to modify it in a way that only that particular generation will be affected. For example, it would be only in male plants that don't have pollen, for example, or if you're talking about a mosquito, only male mosquitoes, and they can't pass it down to the female mosquito. So does this enter into March Against Monsanto, where there's more ethical ways of genetically modifying organisms so that they don't affect future generations?
Well, our stance is that there's no moral grounds for genetically engineered technology, animals or plants. So we are strongly opposed to genetically engineered animals or plants. We don't think genetic engineering is something that should be done. Basically, our first goal is to label, but the March Against Monsanto Tampa group, one of our mission statements is to eventually get GMOs banned. They're banned in a lot of other countries in the European Union, and we would like to have them banned here as well.
Our guest is Christine Wall. She's helping to organize this Saturday's March Against Monsanto Tampa. It's 12:19 in the afternoon. You're listening to MidPoint on 88.5 FM, WMNF Tampa. We have Rick in Clearwater on the air. What's on your mind, Rick?
I want to thank you for having this program. Number one, there's a very interesting interview that you can watch. I saw it on YouTube. It's between Dr. Mercola, M-E-R-C-O-L-A, and Dr. Huber, who is with Purdue University. And he talks about exactly what happens with the plants in the ground when they're using the Roundup Ready crops, and it's creating a certain organism that they're unaware of. It's a two-part interview, and each part's about an hour. As far as like the seed production is concerned, if you look into it, you'll find out that Monsanto owns most of the seed companies out there. And a lot of people don't even know what a GMO is, but if they look at some of the experiments that were done on rats eating GMO corn and how it sterilized the rats within 3 generations, I think that's a very interesting consideration for people. And that's about what I have to say, but I say to that lady, congratulations, and thank you for doing what you're doing.
All right, Rick, thanks so much for those comments. So maybe we got a little bit ahead of ourselves. Why don't we talk about what is genetically modifying an organism? So you're not talking about where you have, you have a one breed of dog and you have a second breed of dog and you create a hybrid of dogs. You're actually going into the DNA into the cells and into the DNA of an organism and adding DNA from one organism into the DNA of another organism in a lab setting, and then letting that propagate. Am I describing it kind
Yes, yes, that's exactly right. So you're taking DNA from one species and you're transporting it into another species. And I use something called a gene gun to do this. So this is something that would never, ever happen in nature. They've actually taken DNA from one species of animal and put it into plants. I believe it was fish genes that they put in the flavor saver tomato. So this is something that could never, never happen in nature. And we don't know the consequences of this, okay? Once the gene pool is contaminated, it's permanently contaminated. You can't go back and take it away and fix it or clean it up.
All right, thanks for bringing that up. Rick, let's move on to another caller. Oh, thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Rick.
We have Kurt in Clearwater. Hi, Kurt.
Oh, hi. First I want to say thank you very much, Christine, for your great dedication. And wanted to point out that if someone would like to brush up more on the issue, we have a huge list of links on the links page at wearechangetampa.org entitled Food is Farm Freedom, Anti-Genetically Modified Organisms, Anti-Genetic Engineering and Preparedness. That's at wearechangetampa.org on the links page. And I want to point out that so many folks say, well, we've been doing genetic engineering for decades or for centuries. Well, what they're referring to is hybridization, taking two different strains and allowing them to cross-pollinate, and then the result is offspring that may or may not be able to reproduce. If it does reproduce, it's going to be a much smaller plant, and then you will certainly not get another generation out of that. No more reproduction after that. As opposed, in contrast to the cross-pollination of the terminator seeds that Monsanto and other agribusiness giants offer, is that when there isn't 100% success with the terminator seeds, then they cross-pollinate, and then the result is a strain that is very unreliable. So you're not going to have a much lower terminator. If you could perhaps address that, and also
can you address the terminator seeds?
Yes, I want to.
Okay,
good.
You do that first, and
tolerant sorghum. Are there other plants that are aluminum tolerant? Makes me wonder if they are trying to market to the increased levels of aluminum that are being found in our soil, I believe, as a result of the chemtrail spraying. And in the Seralini study, you might want to comment on that. The rat study was just justified this past January. It's showing that the rat fed I think it was a 20-week diet of GMOs, developed those massive tumors, and they were justified this past January.
All right, Kurt, thanks for those thoughts. We do have a lot to say about that. So first, Christine, the terminator seeds. Tell us about that.
Oh, the terminator seeds are my personal least favorite. So terminator seed technology was actually developed in coordination with the United States Department of Agriculture, which is kind of scary. Terminator seed technology makes seeds sterile. So we all know how plants grow. Most of them produce seeds, and then the farmers harvest the seeds from the best and the strongest crops, right, the tastiest ones, and they plant them in the ground and they grow again. Well, with terminator seed technology, the seeds are all sterile.
I'm going to ask an obvious question, but why would you do that?
Because then you have to buy your seeds from Monsanto again the next year. It's all about the money. And because of transgenic mutation, and we cannot stop the wind, what if terminator seed technology transfers to the crops that we want to grow in our own garden, or the crops that grow in organic gardens, or transfers all over the country? There's no way to stop that technology. It changes fundamentally the way plants have grown on the planet since the beginning of time.
Kurt also mentioned aluminum in the soil.
I'm not really sure that I can speak to that. I know that glyphosate, Roundup, the way that it works in some degree is it chelates the minerals out of the plant, so it's not able to soak up the nutrients that it needs to be healthy, and that's why they shrivel and die. I'm not sure where the aluminum comes in. I'd have to do a little bit more research on that.
All right. Well, thanks so much for that call, Kurt. I'm going to read an email or two. Dennis writes from Sarasota that he wants to know what the Superfund and hazardous waste sites that Monsanto is responsible for. So I'm going to ask Christine about that in just a second. And he says, when I was at the University of West Florida in Pensacola in the early 70s, Monsanto wanted to inject its waste chemicals into deep wells, thus threatening the water supply. So it's been intent on poisoning us for a very long time. And regarding the ag-gag laws, I concur they're likely unconstitutional. Do you know if any court has ruled on that issue? I'm going to ask Christine in a second. And finally, Dennis says, please repeat often and when and where the marches will be, particularly in Sarasota. So in Sarasota, it's on Saturday. These are all on Saturday. This one starts early. They're gathering at 8:30 and they're marching at 9. It's outside the Whole Foods, which is 1541 First Street in downtown Sarasota. In Spring Hill, the March Against Monsanto is the waterfall at US 19 and Spring Hill Drive. They're starting at 10. And Christine, the one in Tampa that you're helping to organize, that's at Gaslight Square Park, and that's from 10 to 2 on Saturday in downtown Tampa.
Correct.
So what can you tell us about the Superfund sites and the waste sites that Monsanto is responsible for?
Well, I don't have a list of those in front of me, but I can tell you about what happened in Anniston, Alabama. In Anniston, Alabama, PCBs were released from a Monsanto chemical plant. PCBs are very, very toxic. They're a huge environmental concern. They're still causing havoc in soil and water that they are present in. The residents of Anniston, Alabama have rates of PCBs in their bloodstream still, this is decades later, of thousands of times of what's acceptable by the EPA. So that was a lower socioeconomic community that had a Monsanto chemical plant close to it. The water was discharged into the river, spread to the soil, etc., and now the citizens are still continuing to suffer and have not had any recourse from Monsanto. And this is one of the reasons that the International Tribunal is going to happen in The Hague, because citizens and human beings have not been able to have recourse against Monsanto. So the goal of this tribunal is to have legal counsel and judges start to make grounds for victims to be able to sue Monsanto and have legal groundwork set for that to happen.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to MidPoint. We have a few minutes more with Christine Wall. She's helping to organize this Saturday's March Against Monsanto in Tampa. And in a moment, we're going to be talking about Hands Across the Sand, which is about oil in banning oil drilling in Florida and off the Gulf of Mexico. And if you'd like to call in, give us a call, 813-239-9663. I'm going to read one email and then try to squeeze in one more phone call before we switch guests. Anita is saying, ask veterans still suffering from it and the Vietnamese people, it being Agent Orange. So she's talking about the role Monsanto has in people's health. And finally, let's for this segment, let's go to Rich in Tampa. Hi, Rich. What would you like to ask Christine?
They're still trying to sneak the TPP through on the lame duck part of this presidential thing. That is really bad for us as far as the genetically modified organisms.
That's the TPP.
Well, what's the connection? I mean, do we know if there's anything?
I heard that the TPP is going to hurt us as far as genetically modified organisms, and telling us that it's on the label of the food. They're going to really do away with a lot of labeling of food the TPP passes. And I just wonder if she knows anything about that.
I don't know the specifics of the bill. Of course, that bill is, I think, thousands of pages long. But I do think that one of the things the bill does is gives corporations more rights than they already have, so that there's less recourse for people that are hurt by corporations to do anything about it.
Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you, Rich. And if you're on the phone, I do want you to hold on. We'll go back to the phone lines in just a few minutes, but I do want to thank my guest for joining us. Thanks so much for joining us on WMNF's MidPoint today, Christine.
Thank you so much for having me.
Christine Wall is helping to organize this Saturday's March Against Monsanto Tampa. That's at 10 o'clock, from 10 to 2 in downtown Tampa at Gaslight Square Park. And there's also one in Sarasota, one in Spring Hill. I'm going to put the information up on our website later on. That's WMNF.org/news. And our next guest we'll be back in just a minute after this quick music break to talk about Hands Across the Sand, and we'll continue to take your calls. The number is 813-239-9663.